I mean, Facebook is, of course, incentivized to focus on what gets public attention. And in other areas, it can make sense. If it's, for instance, misinformation, if a politician says the moon is made out of green cheese or something, I mean, is it really that bad? If a politician says the moon is made out of green cheese and then an angry crowd storms Cape Canaveral trying to hijack a rocket to fly to the moon and steal the cheese, then, I mean, the media reaction would be much worse, and this serves as a proxy of how bad it actually is.
Hi everyone. Before we get started, I have to plug a few quick things. First of all, my book, Brexit, The Establishment Civil War, is now available to order. You can read some chapter previews by following the link in the description below. Our sponsors, ExpressVPN, get 35% off 12 months of ExpressVPN and get 25% off podcast hosting with Podium. Finally, if you're watching this on YouTube, please go check out odyssey.com instead. We are hosting all our videos there. If you're a creator, you can move your videos across with one simple click, and you can earn cryptocurrency simply by watching videos and use it to tip your favorite creators like myself. So please check that all out if you want to support the show. Anyway, here's the podcast. So hello and welcome to another episode of Chatter. Today I'm here with Sophie Zhang, who is a Facebook whistleblower and data scientist. So Sophie, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you very much. A pleasure to talk to you today.
No problem. So before we start, I have to quickly plug two things. First of all, my book, Brexit, The Establishment Civil War, is available to order now. You can go check out some chapter previews in the link below. And thanks to our sponsor, ExpressVPN, you can currently get 35% off 12 months of ExpressVPN by going to the link in the description below. So, Sophie, thanks very much for joining me. Do you want to give a little bit of background, maybe just on yourself and understand, or let people understand who you are and what your background is before we go into the whole saga?
Oh, absolutely. So yes, I'm Sophie Zhang. I was a data scientist at Facebook. I joined in January of 2018. I was fired in September of 2020, and so this was really just my second job out of grad school. I mean, I've been in the technology industry in the Bay Area since 2015. Before that, I was studying physics at graduate school before I ran away. And so at Facebook, what I worked on, the team was called fake engagement. And by fake, I mean inauthentic accounts, which can be fake accounts, hacked accounts, if I hack into your account and do something nefarious with it, or even self-compromised accounts in which actual people are persuaded to give over access to their account to let other people do nefarious things with it. And by engagement, I mean likes, comments, shares, etc. And so most people, when they hear this, their mind immediately goes to Russian bots, Brexit, the United States, etc. But the thing to realize is that most people, of course, are not politicians, and most things on social media are apolitical, and so the vast majority of this sort of activity isn't political in any way at all. Rather, it's ordinary people like yourself and me, who go on Facebook and make a post and see, oh, hey, my post on Facebook got 5 likes. Okay, that's good, I guess. And then I go, look, my friend made a post. It got 50 likes. I can see my post. I can see my friend's post. My post is just as good as my friend's. What's wrong with me? There's nothing wrong with me. The people just don't realize how great I am. I know how to solve this. I'll go on Google and search for buy Facebook likes, and this will clearly solve the problem. Because, of course, the vast promise of social media is that you have potential access to a vast audience, and anyone can really speak to the entire world. And the curse of social media is that most people do not actually get to that vast audience. And because of the way it works, people see what's popular. They naturally see people who are more popular than they are. Just as, like, if you read the news, you hear about people who are more famous than you most of the time. And so I'm sure this does not great sense to people's self-esteem or etc. And so that's where the vast majority of fake engagement actually goes. And so my job was essentially to root it out. But in but in my spare time, I was moonlighting to look at political activity, which again was a vast minority of the actual abuse vector, because most people are not politicians.
So how big is the market for people buying engagement?
I really don't. I mean, are you looking for a volume number, a percentage number? I don't know. Like, I can give you a guess, but I mean, it's certainly quite large. It's more prominent in some areas than others, but I mean, if you go by Facebook likes, you get plenty of results yourself. I mean, it's more normalized in some areas than others, just like in Britain, for instance. I'm sure most people obey traffic signals, but if you go to other countries, people might see red lights more as a suggestion and drive through them anyways. So I think there's a similar dynamic. In some countries, it's far more normalized than others. And so, like, there's certainly a significant market. There's I mean, it's also hard to say precisely what's, because because you can see that something inauthentic was delivered, but you don't know precisely the means by how it was delivered and what the exact source was, and so it's hard to give a precise answer. And I'm sorry if that sounds like a quibble or a hedge, but I don't know what I don't know.
No, it's all right. It just popped into my head. I was like, I wonder what sort, like, if you had any ideas of what sort of size the amount of money that people were spending on this was. That'll be an interesting one. If I find any answers to that, I'll put them in the description below for people.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I can give you an estimate, but it would take me a while to think through it, and I don't think you want me to do that during this interview.
No, we'll stick to asking you about stuff you know. So what made you want to start working at Facebook in the first place? Like, why did you choose there?
Well, I needed a job in the Alfred one. I mean, I needed to.
So you weren't like putting like a young girl, like putting pictures of Mark Zuckerberg on your wall, being like, I want to work for him one day.
Oh, no. I mean, I was very open and upfront when I joined the company. I didn't think that I thought that Facebook was not making the world a better place, and I thought that it was making the world a worse one. And that's precisely why I wanted to join. I wanted to fix it. I was very upfront about that from the start. It just got harder and harder to achieve that within Facebook as time went on.
So was there a moment when you went from realizing that or trying to raise flags about some of the stuff that you've talked about internally, and when you realized that there was not going to be anything done within Facebook and you had to decide to go to the press essentially and become a whistleblower? I
want to be clear that I tried everything I could to fix it within the system. Like, eventually they fired me, and even after they said they were firing me, I offered to stay on as an unpaid volunteer because I thought that it was important for me, because I was basically the only expert in an important area, and I thought it was important to stay on through the 2020 elections. They refused, of course. Certainly I was making. The issue with trying to fix things is that it's always impossible to say what could have happened if you had done something else instead, or if you had done something differently. And maybe, and especially since I had no authority of my own, and what I could get done relied on convincing people, and then frankly, I'm not very good at convincing people. But like it. I did get some things done that certainly would not have been happened without me, but overall, it certainly got more and more difficult over time. And I mean, I think I realize that your podcast tends to be more on the anti-establishment side, but I think that institutions have value, and it's important to try and fix things within the system, to honestly say that you did everything you could to let them try and work before you escalate one step further. That's why ultimately the institutions like government or church or whatever are what holds the world and society together. So I always tried as hard as I could to fix things within the system, and every time it didn't work, I escalated one step further. I mean, when they fired me, I offered to stay on unpaid. When that didn't work, I posted a farewell memo that blew up a bit. And when that didn't accomplish anything, I went to the Guardian. And every time I gave the system a chance to work before I went one step forward. And that's essentially what I'm still doing now.
I mean, my anti-establishment nature tends to be that I would like the institutions to work like they are meant to, rather than a desire to tear them all down. But what did you think that when you mentioned that when you were going into Facebook initially, that you were thinking, okay, they're not making the world a better place, as you said. What specifically did you sort of identify at that point as being a problem, and you wanted to try and help them fix it in some way?
I mean, I mean, like I wasn't very sophisticated in my knowledge of Facebook at the time, but like many people, many people, I was quite concerned about what had happened in 2016, and so essentially, I wanted to keep that from happening again. Essentially, was my idea. I mean, there wasn't more to it. I mean, I was very upfront. Upfront with them from the start. I don't think Facebook is making the world a better place. That's why I'm joining. If a company is perfect, that there's nothing to fix there, and they want to fix it. And they told me you'd be surprised how many people there think that.
So what practices did you then uncover whilst you were working there? Just to give people an idea of the things that you're blowing the whistle about, that you're concerned about.
So like I said, my main job was fake engagement. But in my spare time, I moonlighted in essentially trying to find inauthentic, sophisticated political activity. And to the average layperson, these may sound quite similar, but they're quite different in scope and organization. It's sort of like the analogy that I'm going to use is the difference between a local village policeman in Britain and Scotland Yard. Like officially, there's sort of both law enforcement, but one is much more prestigious, well-trained, sophisticated, high-profile than the other. And if you talk to a Scotland Yard policeman, you compare him to a local village policeman, he might get a bit upset at you. And so in this analogy, I was a local village policewoman who kept finding things that went up to Scotland Yard. And so this created interesting dynamics, because on one hand, in this analogy, Scotland Yard was happy that they kept getting this for free. On the other hand, they were maybe a bit annoyed. They were being shown up by a local village police person. They were given extra work, and the village police chief was unhappy. Why are you doing this instead of focusing on local village crime, or etc.? And so anyways, in my time at Facebook, I caught multiple world governments, the government of Honduras and the government of Azerbaijan, red-handed. Both were essentially running troll farms to mislead and manipulate their domestic populace by running fake accounts, fake pages in vast numbers. And I realize that most people, when they think of troll farms interference, they immediately think of foreign interference, but most people care more about their own country. Like Britons care more about Britain than any other country, presumably. Americans care more about America, and apparently the same applies to world governments. And so when I first found Honduras, I was very naive. I thought that I'd hand it over to the right people. They'd care about it, problem solved. I can get back to my actual job. Instead, it was the start of a Sisyphean 2-year ordeal. But it took almost a year to get action done on Honduras, and they returned almost immediately afterwards. And Azerbaijan took more than a year.
So just to give people a good idea, because I mean it's talked about a lot that, you know, there was Russian trolls on Facebook who were, you know, interfering in the 2016 election or in the Brexit vote, and there's been allegations around the world of different campaigns like this, some of which you have brought to light with your story. So what is it that the troll farms are doing? What are these bots doing or attempting to do that is so bad?
So I'm just going to start up with a clarification. So people often use the word bots interchangeably to refer to both scripted accounts that don't have a real person behind them, that are running a script like this at X time, like that at X time, etc. And they also use the word bots to refer to refer to actual people sitting at the computer who are doing things based on some campaign-based fake accounts, etc. And 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 this and to the average layperson, they may seem similar, but they're actually very different, because actual people are, of course, smarter than computer scripts, and it's the reason why you still have a job after all. I mean,
For now.
I mean, if someone made a script that could pass the Turing test, they would be making trillions on Silicon Valley rather than running some shoddy troll farm for Honduras or etc. and so I want to distinguish between these two types of activity because they're commonly conflated. And what we see with literal actual bots and scripted activity, it's generally activity that can be large in volume, but it's very stupidly run or silly. But like, for instance, if you have a British politician and all his funnels are from Bangladesh or something like that. Or if you, I mean, they're good at doing things in large volume, but they're not very smart about it or sophisticated about it. And actual people tend to be much more effective, but they're also much more pricey because, of course, I mean, you have to pay people to do things. They don't do things for free, and so when you go online and purchase inauthentic activity, it's usually scripted inauthentic activity. And the actual sophisticated humans, they tend to be either dedicated to a specific area or contractors who are essentially operate as for hire mercenaries. And so talking about what they're doing, I mean, it can depend over the place, but often I mean, when most people hear about troll farms and etc., they immediately think about persuasion, and that's certainly one potential area. That is, the trolls convince people to do X when they initially intended to do Y, and that's something. And that's certainly a concern I have. And it takes a certain amount of sophistication, though, to do persuasion, in that you're not going to persuade someone by having 1,000 comments on your politician's page saying, "Great, congratulations, amazing," etc. Which is, I mean, the best you can do with shoddy automated scripts, because, I mean, automated scripts are not very good at writing the creative comments. And I also want to be I also want to be clear that what I worked on was not the most cutting edge when it came to technical ability, because, I mean, I wasn't highly trained. I was looking for essentially catching the low hanging fruit, because that was simply there because no one had gone out and looked for it before. These were, I mean, in law enforcement, you say innocent until proven guilty, and proving guilt can be hard at times. But these were people who were essentially signing their name in the blood of the victim with their own fingerprints. They were the opposite of trying to hide, and so what I found was, by definition, not very technically adept at hiding, because I found the people who were not trying very hard to hide. And so I'm sure Russia is much more sophisticated, but I did not catch Russia because they were not completely stupid at trying to hide, because there are actual people looking for Russia or etc. And so what I found and so anyways, going back to the point, I was talking about persuasion. So the most sophisticated attempt at persuasion I saw was actually in India, and I realized that Britons are not actually familiar with Indian political parties. So I'm going to use an analogy to translate this to a hypothetical example in the British context to explain. And again, just to be clear, this did not happen in Britain. I'm just trying to explain for a British context. So for instance, imagine that there's a local elections in Britain. And actually, there were local elections quite recently, a few days ago. And so imagine that in the lead up to the election, in a constituency that voted Tories, let's say, there were lots of comments below the Tory the pages of local Tory politicians, the saying, I voted Boris Johnson because we needed to get Brexit done, but I'm voting Labour because we need to something Labour, etc. Etc. Or Boris Johnson is getting Brexit done. Now Labour will build a better country, or something like that. I don't know Labour political slogans. So a lot of comments like that, except smarter than what I just said, that are essentially trying to get crossover political support. And so that's certainly and so that's an example of a campaign that I saw in India, not in Britain. Again, this did not happen in Britain. I'm using this as an example because I realize British people probably do not know Indian politics. And so that's the thing that most people think about. And the second that I do want to highlight, it's that of perception hacking. And there are multiple dimensions to perception hacking and thinking people are more popular than they actually are. In countries like Britain, for instance, where Britain, of course, has a multi-party political system, so people have to decide who they want to vote for based on tactical considerations. Whether they might want to vote against Labour, and so they have to decide: do I want to vote Lib Dem? Do I vote Tory? Do I vote someone else, etc. Or etc. And so in that case. The perception of how popular a candidate is can potentially, I'm not an expert, I'm not a political scientist, it can potentially make a difference on how many people actually vote for them. Because if you say Lib Dem running for parliament and you have 2 likes on Facebook, people probably will not see you as very credible or something, and so you have a vested incentive to make yourself seem more credible. And so that's one consideration. And the second that I'm personally more concerned about is as follows. So in countries that face periods of turmoil, like dictatorships, like countries that face the risk of coup d'etat, revolution, popular uprisings, political scientists have generally said that in those times, popularity it does not matter so much as the perception of popularity. And what I mean by that is this: because in a dictatorship, people have a strong incentive to pretend that they support the dictator, because otherwise they'll face consequences. But if you're a dissident, then you also need to make yourself known to other dissidents so you can band together and overthrow the dictator. And so you may end up with a situation in which everyone hates the dictator, but they're too terrified of acting and they think that everyone else likes the dictator, and so the dictator stays in place. Because in a dictatorship, when there's an uprising, when there's a coup d'etat, then suddenly everyone needs to make a decision: do I support the revolution, or do I support the government? And if you choose incorrectly, you may face death. And so people make the considerations based on who they think will win. And it's the same reason why in many countries in the old Eastern Bloc, the Warsaw Pact, dictators felt the need to bus in crowds to show paid supporters to show that they still had the support of the people. Because if you're a dictator and you're speaking to an empty plaza, you're just an embarrassment. But the thing about social media is that, like, when you bus in actual crowds of actual people, you have to have actual people. Like, if you go to a political rally, no person can pretend to be a sultan at a political rally. I don't even know how that should work. But on social media, one person can easily pretend to be a sultan supporters or such, so it makes it much more easily scalable. And they see this as essentially, and so in many countries like Honduras and Azerbaijan, I see this as essentially a continuation of the busting crowds of the Eastern Bloc. And because popularity can have a very large impact on the survival of authoritarian government, like the most dramatic example perhaps happened in Romania in 1980 during the Romanian Revolution, the dictator Nicolae Ceausescu, he was speaking to a crowd of Bestin supporters in Bucharest, when suddenly for the first time he was booed to his face. And this had never happened before. This was a crowd of Bestin people who were essentially incentivized to support him. And in one moment, he was the dictator who ruled with an iron fist and had the terror of the people. In the next, he was suddenly an old man shouting at people to get their attention. And the crowd turned on him in the streets of Bucharest. The revolution started in the capital. The next day, the army joined the revolutionaries, and within a few days, he was given a show trial and executed. And this is a very dramatic example, of course, but it shows. But I think it succinctly illustrates why, in the old countries of the Warsaw Pact, dictators felt such a strong need to Bessin supporters to show that they still had the support of the people, because they knew what would happen if suddenly that was in question.
It's kind of similar to the way in which, for example, in America there in 2016, when Bernie Sanders was running for the Democratic nominee, Hillary Clinton obviously had a lot of institutional support and support online, but Bernie Sanders was the one with like 10,000 people at his rallies. So it shows you how it's easy to paint like a picture of popularity, but when it comes to who would actually go out on the street and do something about, go to protest something or go to support a candidate, that it provides, you get to see when you get to see it in real life, you can know these people are real, and otherwise it's very difficult to tell online.
So, but at the same time, like, not everyone goes to political rallies. Not everyone goes. I mean, there are plenty of people who vote who don't go to see candidates because they have actual day jobs. They don't want to see the candidates. They're cynical and think that all the candidates are the same, etc. And it's one metric of support. It's certainly not all of them. And especially when you add on the situation with the pandemic, there's additional dimensions to it. But people see support in person that's often more real than social media.
So you're basically saying that the problem is that people, when you're going online, that the perception that someone is popular essentially leads you to perhaps support their popularity, that we tend to.
I think that's the popular assumption, but I'm not so sure about it. But I'm not personally that sure about it. But again, I am not an expert. I mean, there's a bit of a bandwagon effect, I suppose. But most people, you tell a Labour supporter that the Tories won the by-election in Hartlepool, I think. I don't know how to pronounce it, and I don't think that's going to convince any Labour supporters to suddenly vote Tory or something. I mean, maybe it would. I'm not an expert. I'm not a political scientist.
I'd be interested to see. It'd be very difficult to do a study on trying to figure out what the impact of seeing those supporting posts, like, for example, the ones the example you used, the hypothetical where, underneath the Tory candidate, you would see people saying, oh, well, I used to vote Labour, but I'm going to vote for the Tory because this reason, or vice versa. I'd be intrigued to see how much of an impact that could actually have on someone's opinion.
It's really hard. It's really hard to test, and it would also be extremely hard to test ethically, because. But I'm sure someone could. I'm sure someone could do a study. But there are just so many different and disparate impacts, and presumably it would work better in some countries than others.
So one of the claims you made is that investment priorities. The quote I found was that investment priorities and associated internal workload makes it impossible to properly manage political manipulations. So do you think that this is because of just like pure profit motives? Is this by design? And would it even be possible to try and like effectively regulate the things that you've been highlighting, or is that just not possible in your mind, at least?
Okay, so I'm going to break this down into separate questions, of course. So the first is, why is this going on? Why doesn't Facebook pay more attention? And I'm just going, and I think it's quite simple. At the end of the day, Facebook is a company. It's in the business of making money. It's not in the business of fixing the world out of the goodness of its hearts. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg needs to sleep at the end of the night, but I mean, you don't expect Philip Morris Tobacco to reimburse the NHS when someone gets cancer and they have to get non-cancer treatment. You don't expect the financial banks to keep the world economy from crashing. So, and that's why many countries have federal reserves, national banks that do this for them. And so an economist would call this an externality problem. That is, that the cost is borne not by the company, but by the rest of the world, because that's ultimately what's happening. Like Facebook doesn't care if Azerbaijan is repressing its own citizens on Facebook, except that Facebook employees need to sleep at night. They're also human like you and me. And but the costs are borne, of course, by the people of Azerbaijan. But there's an additional dimension to this that makes it much more complicated, and that's the fact that this is going to sound very obvious as soon as I say it, but it's actually an interesting point. The point of inauthentic activity is to not be seen. And in fact, the better you are at not being seen, the fewer people will see you. And so when the average layperson goes out and looks for inauthentic things, they are afraid of Russian bots, Brexit bots, etc. They go out and look on social media. They do not find actual people who are good at not being seen. They find people who are completely incompetent and terrible at not being seen, or they find people who are actually want to be seen and are pretending very hard that they don't want to be seen. And so this creates a perverse dynamic. I mean, Facebook is, of course, incentivized to focus on what gets public attention. And in other areas, it can make sense. If it's, for instance, misinformation, if a politician says the moon is made out of green cheese or something, I mean, is it really that bad? If a politician says the moon is made out of green cheese, and then an angry crowd storms Cape Canaveral trying to hijack a rocket to fly to the moon and steal the cheese, then I mean, the media reaction would be much worse, and this serves as a proxy of how bad it actually is. And I'm sorry for the absurd example, but I mean, I wanted to make an example without actually offending anyone, I hope.
No, that's a great example.
and so the point, but with inauthenticity, what gets public attention is not the same as what is actually bad. And so this creates perverse dynamics in which a company focuses on what gets attention rather than what's actually bad. And economists would call this an information asymmetry problem. That the only person who can really know what's going on inside Facebook is Facebook itself, but they don't have incentives to fix it. And so using an analogy again, suppose we live in a world in which cigarettes still give people cancer, but the only people who know that are the cigarette companies, and the only people who can figure that out are the cigarette companies. Then I mean, people won't be able to make smart decisions. The government can't regulate. And the libertarian would say that people can make their own decisions, and something free market, voice of the people. And more mainstream economists would say that the government should step in. But both of these require people to know what's going on. And so you can't solve a problem until it exists. And that's part of the reason I'm coming forward, to at least bring attention to that this is going on, so that hopefully the world can try to fix it in some way or form. And the second question you asked is about regulation. And I want to be very clear about this. I am not a regulation expert. I am not a policy expert. I am not a legislator. I can give you my ideas, but they will quite frankly probably be stupid ones, because again, I am not an expert. But I mean, I'm enough of an idealist that I think that the government certainly could have a role in fixing the problem. So a good chunk of the difficulty, though, is the multinational nature of the problem. That is, I don't think any country would feel comfortable about essentially letting the United States decide what flies on their own social media. On the other hand, if you take this to the United Nations or something, then the dictatorships of the world would, quite frankly, probably get together and say every country can do whatever it wants on its own social media, which is not great either. And so I think it makes sense for perhaps the OECD countries, for the European nations, for the United States and Canada, for Australia and Japan and etc. to come together and work out a collective solution. In part because if one country tries going at it alone, I'm sure you're familiar with what happened in Australia right now. And also just because, I don't think it's the place of one country to dictate the rest of the world in general.
There's a few US states who are suggesting laws about controlling censorship or clampdowns, or they're all very vague and I think not particularly well thought out at the minute. But I am at least optimistic that people are moving in this direction, because you can't solve the problem unless you're.
I do want to be clear that there's multiple different dimensions to potential problems with Facebook, and they only worked on one of them. So one of the concerns is about privacy, of course, and the European Union has GDPR. Many nations, like all US states, have started having privacy laws, and I did not work on privacy. And actually, privacy is too a bit a natural enemy of security, because, quite frankly, you need data to find things, and I think it's important to balance the two. And so I can't give you a strong opinion on the privacy. The second is content moderation, which again I did not work on. So this is will take a bit of an explanation, because the average person, they think when they hear inauthentic accounts, they also think misinformation, but these are actually completely separate problems that are completely independent of one another. And what I mean by this is that misinformation is a content problem. It doesn't matter whether you're a fake account, a real person, a grandmother who likes to knit at night, a prime minister, a president. If you say the moon is made out of green cheese, the moon is not actually made out of green cheese. I hope that people know that. And that's very clearly misinformation. If you say that moon people are evil and need to die, that's quite clearly hate speech. I'm using a fake made up example because I don't actually offend anyone. And so the facets of content violations is that, first of all, they tend to be noticeable to the public. The public can look at content and decide, is it bad or not? Is it hate speech? Is it misinformation? So, secondly, they're independent of who the person saying it, and they tend to be easy to determine but people have lots of philosophical disagreements on where the line should be drawn and acting on them. By which I mean that, of course, many people are like freedom of speech, but how bad is too bad? Do we let if the moon is made out of green cheese fly? But if they start on Cape Canaveral, like, what's the difference really? The statement is the same. We have to consider context, and context is messy. And I worked instead on inauthenticity, which is really completely independent and agnostic of what the thing is saying. If I use a fake account to say cats are adorable or dogs are cute, puppies are cute, there is technically nothing wrong with what I'm saying. Cats are adorable and puppies are cute. However, I am using a fake account to say it, so it's still inauthentic. And so this has multiple facets that they mention. In that, first, it's basically very hard for the public to determine if something is inauthentic. You see that someone's saying puppies are adorable, kittens are adorable. I'm totally not biased. But you don't know if it's a real person or not. You can try to make your guesses. The guesses are often not very accurate. On the other hand, once you agree that something is fake, it tends to be very uncontroversial, by which I mean I am not aware of anyone serious defending the widespread use of fake accounts. I haven't heard anyone saying, yeah, politicians should be allowed to run hundreds of fake accounts supporting themselves. I mean, I can't imagine anyone saying that. I mean, there's a lot of people in the world. I'm sure these people exist, but it can be very Manichaean, black and white in comparison, and that's part of the reason I wanted to work on it, because I didn't have to worry about what I was doing was the right thing or not. I knew that what I was working on was wrong, and I was getting rid of it. And so most concerns on Facebook have focused on inauthenticity and privacy, but content moderation and privacy. But inauthenticity is a separate dimension that I don't think has faced regulation of notable sorts. In addition, with the privacy and content moderation dynamics, regulation has generally been in the area of Facebook is doing too much, and people should have more rights, people should have more leeway, etc. Which, I mean, people can come to their own conclusions about that, but that's the general gist of the legislation and regulation that I've seen. With inauthenticity, my personal concern is that Facebook is not doing enough. And so I hope I'm being clear about the different facets and dynamics of the problem.
No, you're being really clear. It's so right now, when will this go out? This will be out in about 2 weeks, so I can talk about this. So I'm in the middle of writing a book about the whole GameStop saga, and right now I'm focused on a bit where I'm trying to talk about on the online on Reddit and in the Discord communities. There's been a lot of talk of bots in both contexts that you talked about, scripts and people being paid to post things or upvote things or downvote things. And it is a really interesting to hear you, who has worked on the moderation side of it, like help define the different types of ways in which these problems can manifest themselves.
Yeah.
I was curious as to what you thought was the most, like, what is the worst form? Do you find that misinformation itself is do you think is something that needs to be clamped down on more, or do you see this inauthenticity as something that's worse? Because
so I wanted to, so there's a number of questions here, and I'm going to unpack them. And first is that you were talking about GameStop and concern about bots and etc. And I just want to extend a word of caution, because I'm not personally familiar with, but the common trend I've seen is that normal people are extremely terrible at actually finding bots, because again, the point of trying not to be seen is that you are, the fewer people will see you.
This is what makes it so fascinating.
And there was a quite prominent example of this actually in Britain back in 2019, which I think was reported in the BBC. And that was the Boris bots saga, that there were a lot of people who were in the comments under Prime Minister Boris Johnson's page making comments, and at first it was brilliant Boris, I support Boris 100%, etc., all posting relatively the same thing. Eventually they began posting broken pseudocode, and people were very concerned about this. I was urgently tasked with investigating this twice in like September and October. Eventually it went to Facebook like 6 times in total. I stopped paying attention after the first 2. But the thing to realize is that these were not bots. These were actual people, actual Britons who were organically and coordinating with each other because they believed that it would be humorous to troll their political opponents by pretending to be badly disguised bots. And it would be funny if it wasn't so sad. Because, I mean, and of course, that's saga, like the people concerned about bots were naturally concerned about Russia, Brexit, Redux, or etc. And but although their intentions were positive, ultimately it played more into Russia's hands by furthering the idea of Russian ubiquity and omnipotence, that Russia is everywhere and doing everything. And it also further divided the country because the political left was understandably concerned about these obvious spots supporting Boris Johnson. This is Russia again. Why isn't anyone paying attention? And the political right were concerned about, well, yeah, the left always thinks that we're bots and we're actual real people. They're just trying to delegitimize our actual voices and etc. And I realize that some people hearing this will probably want to go and pretend to be bots, but I'm asking you, please don't do that, because it will not make the mess any better.
Uh,
And I hope, but the point I'm making is that when people go look for bots, they often find things that they think are bots, but are often not actually bots, and they can't speak specifically about the GameStop saga case, but I want to be extended a word of caution there. The second thing, of course, is you were talking about misinformation and inauthenticity and which one is worse. And I think they're they're completely separate. They're orthogonal problems, and they only worked on one of them. It's like if you ask a policeman who works on murder whether he thinks murder is rape or worse, he'll probably tell you that murder is worse. And if you ask a policeman who works on rape if he thinks rape is worse than murder, he'll probably tell you that rape is worse, or etc. I hope and so of course I have my biases and I'm trying to separate them out for this interview. But anyways, they're separate problems, and I think that misinformation is probably much more widespread in the Western political contexts, however. And I think that the focus often is on inauthenticity, in part because, people are, for lack of a better word, traumatized by 2016, in that they keep seeing the relics of the trauma everywhere. They're afraid of the same thing happening again. And I'm not
seeing the ghosts of the Russian bots everywhere. Yeah.
And also because people can agree. Inauthenticity is something that people agree on. No one's saying that Russian bots should be allowed to do things. No one's saying that politicians should be able to get fake accounts to do things. And on the other hand, misinformation is very controversial. In the United States especially, but I'm sure also in Britain, because no one can, because something censorship. What should the prime minister be allowed to say? Should Facebook be allowed to take down a US president, etc.? But I think that's and I want to be clear that I did not work on misinformation. I encountered it by happenstance sometimes, but it was not my focus or my area of expertise. At least in the Western political context, it certainly appears to be more of a problem.
The thing that I picked up, the thing that I'm really looking at on the GameStop saga at the minute, at least anyway, is this thing where there are trackers that will track the mentions of specific stocks on the subreddits, and then there seems to be posts then related to whatever like the specific abbreviation is that keeps getting posted by users, but then there'll be seeming like spams of it, and they're picking up on things that aren't actually stock names, but they're just things that people are saying, like abbreviations of like either joke stock names, or people were talking about SSR, which is short selling requirement, as far as I'm aware. It's like a term to do with it. And then all of a sudden there was lots of people posting about how you had to buy that stock even though it's not actually a stock. It's fascinating to try and figure out what's going on with that. But I'm really curious as to you said the Boris bots turned out to be people coordinating to post. So how do you figure that out? So if this comes across your desk, like what is it that you're looking at?
I'm not going to go into the details of that, and the real students would be disappointed. But the reason of that is quite simple, and that's that actual Russians are perfectly capable of watching your podcast as well, and actual people who want to do bad things, and they will tell you how I caught a criminal. Future criminals will know how to not get caught, and etc.
That's fair enough. I hadn't even thought of that. So Why do you think governments have sort of been either reluctant or unable to make any kind of regulations on either inauthenticity, misinformation, or just over Facebook and social media firms generally? There seems to be like a reluctance to try and make any laws that would regulate it. Why do you think that is?
So I want to decompress this. So first of all, I mean, I think before misinformation, it's a thorny philosophical issue. Like many countries want to respect freedom of speech in some way or form, and telling a private company that some specific amounts types of dialogue aren't permitted on the aren't permitted. It's something that most countries would do only in extraordinary circumstances. Like I believe Germany bans Holocaust denial, for instance, or something like that. But but most countries don't have bans of that sort. And so I think it's the case in which really the laws and society and legislators and society aren't equipped for the new problems of the 21st century, really. But I am really not an expert on misinformation. And with inauthenticity, meanwhile, I'd say that there's several dimensions to it. The first is that it's hard for legislators to act on what they don't know. Like I said, the second is that the bulk of the inauthenticity problems I saw and worked on were in foreign countries, in broadly the global south, in Latin America, in Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, Southeast Asia. But I saw very few of them in Europe and North America. And I mean, okay, I'm excluding Latin America from North America, but you know. And the reason I think of that, I think it's a combination of cultural dynamics. Like in other countries, I've caught politicians red-handed who are happily running fake accounts to support themselves, and I don't think I never found that in, say, a British politician, whether that's because it would never even occur to them, or because they are more afraid of the British press, or etc. I mean, same. But I think that after a certain point, when everyone starts committing bad behavior, then it becomes normalized. I mean, similar to other countries, we're going through a red light. Red lights have become more suggestions than actual laws to be obeyed. Because I mean, if you go stop at the red light and then you see someone else zooming right through past it, you're wondering like, hey, what's going on? It's not like I'm achieving anything effective here. They're driving straight, whether I'm doing it or not, or etc. And so I think that creates a dynamic because of course countries are more concerned with their more domestic priorities, and so they're unfortunately not as concerned about other nations such as Azerbaijan or Honduras or Albania or etc. And I hope this is making sense so far.
No, it is. It totally is. So do you think it's possible to build social media that is less vulnerable? Even just specifically to the authenticity problem that you spoke about?
I think it's possible, but it would have a lot of trade-offs because ultimately there's going to be some level ultimately of inauthenticity no matter what you do, for the same reason that police can't stop a crime from happening before it happens. Because I mean, you think about trade. I mean, the only way they could have that happen is to arrest everyone, and obviously they don't want to do that. Like at Facebook, sorry, my cat came out. He's very demanding for pets.
It's all right.
I lost my train of thought because he was standing up and wanted me to pet him. Anyways, I was talking about you were talking about social media authenticity. And so on the authenticity side, many of the trade-offs for stopping inauthentic accounts for the first place more constraints on user privacy and make it harder for the user. Like, for instance, a common way that Facebook verifies that you're a real person is that they ask you to provide identification, of course. And many people are very reluctant to do this because they're concerned about Facebook privacy flaws and etc. And so that's a very basic example in that, for instance, Facebook could probably reduce fake accounts on its platform by asking everyone to provide identification no matter what, but that would also be very dissuading and oppressive and alienating for many average individuals. And certainly I think that Facebook could draw the line a bit stricter, but ultimately I don't see really ways to get around that issue without severely compromising user privacy or functionality or etc. And those are maybe trade-offs people want to make, but I want to be clear about the existence of those trade-offs.
So do you see the current giants of social media, like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, essentially TikTok, do you see them remaining as the big platforms, or do you think that we will get new social media that will come up and replace them to an extent?
I am really not an expert on this.
I'm not asking for an expert opinion on this one. This is just what you think.
I mean, I think it's pretty clear right now that these are the social media platforms that dominate social media. And Facebook is still continuing to, I mean, Facebook is a bit like Teflon. It keeps growing no matter what the bad news is and keeps making more and more money. At the same time, past performance is no guarantee of future. It's certainly the case that I've never died before, and yet for some reason, I'm very convinced that it will happen eventually at some point.
Yeah, well, I mean, you never know. 70 years time, you don't know what's going to be possible. I keep, you know, maybe it'd be nice to be able to choose not to die. I don't know. You'd maybe have to be very rich.
Probably.
Yeah. I mean, maybe I don't want to live forever in cyberspace. It's pretty toxic. But Sophie, we are basically at the end of the hour. So yeah, I want to thank you for your time and
Absolutely.
your explanations. It was really, really useful and really informative. Links to anything we've discussed I will put in the description below. Is there anything that you'd like to point people towards or plug before we finish?
Not particularly. Thank you very much for having me on. I hope this was educational to yourself and your listeners.
Well, it definitely was to me. You'll have to ask them. I don't know. So yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, follow me on Twitter, or sign up to our mailing list. Thanks a lot to our sponsor, ExpressVPN, the #1 most trusted VPN. Get lightning fast connectivity with servers in 160 locations across 94 countries. Keep your browsing privacy safe with ExpressVPN and get a 35% discount on 12 months of ExpressVPN when you follow the link in the description below. Don't forget my book is now out and available to order on Amazon and on bookshop.org. That's Brexit, the Establishment Civil War. And most importantly, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.